and welcome back to the Make Your Mind podcast. My name is Jess Leonju, and today I have the privilege of speaking with neuroscientist Dr. Tom Bellamy. And the topic we'll be discussing is a topic called limerence. Now, you might not have heard that word before, but if you've had the experience of having feelings for someone and noticing that that person is taking up much more space in your mind than you'd probably even like to admit to yourself, then you might have had the experience of limerence. And I'm excited to share this episode with you because Tom is going to break down the neuroscience around why this happens to people, what is going on inside of our brains when we come under the spell of this kind of experience. And I think it's so useful understanding these kinds of concepts because the more we can understand the mechanics of how our minds work and the variety that exists between us, the more we can show up for conversations with empathy and curiosity, because our internal worlds are really so diverse. So without further ado, here is Dr. Tom Bellamy. I guess to kick things off, actually, I suppose we are kind of entering into the podcast, but can you please define what is limerence? Because I don't know that many people know what the word is or what the phenomenon is that the blog's based around.
So I think the best description of limerence is that it's an altered mental state. A state of profound romantic infatuation. So it really does feel like your mind is operating in a different mode. And another good way of describing it, although there's sort of nuance to it, but I think it's addiction to another person is perhaps the best way of capturing the whole of the limerent experience. So, but the term itself, limerence, as a word was entirely made up by one person, which was Professor Dorothy Tennov, who introduced the concept of limerence and the word to describe this altered mental state in her book, Love and Limerence, which was published, I think, in 1979 and then updated in 1999. So the origin of the concept of this altered mental state comes from Tennov's work originally. But for me, as a neuroscientist, reading it now, in 2025, we've got an extra, half century of understanding about brain science to apply to this concept and look at limerence as described by Tennov, so the symptoms of the state of being in limerence, from the perspective of neuroscience, and particularly, I think, from the perspective of addiction and behavioral addiction. It's a very useful way of understanding the experience.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, yeah, can you walk me through what neuroscience has been able to add to the conversation about it or add to the understanding of it since she first coined the term?
So, yeah, Tennov was looking at it very much from a kind of behavioral perspective. So she was interviewing individual people going through heartache and trying to understand what were the kind of common elements of the early phase of love when you're falling into love. And again, I think many people will recognize that sensation of being in love. And what Tennov was really trying to do was define that sensation. But what she ended up doing was essentially discovering this idea of limerence that not everybody experiences in the early phases of love. So she was looking at it very much from the perspective of behavior. So what experiences were people having? What emotions were they feeling? What were the kind of common elements to the phenomenon? And so she defined limerence with a list of symptoms. There were sort of 20 things that were, characterize you as being in limerence. So a few things like feeling euphoria when you're with your limerent object, which is another term that she coined to describe that the person that you're infatuated with. So it sounds, I always have to start with definitions about the terms because, calling somebody a limerent object sounds a bit dehumanizing. You're literally objectifying this other person. But Tennov did that for a reason, which was that actually when we are in limerence, we aren't seeing that other person clearly. We're not seeing them as a whole person. We are essentially projecting our own romantic need onto them to an extent and idealizing them, idolizing them. And so to an extent, we do objectify that person. We turn them into a kind of romantic exemplar, not a real person with all their flaws and, all their strengths and weaknesses. So Tennov did use this term limerent object to try and help psychologically orientate you into that idea that what you're doing is objectifying that person by projecting your own romantic ideals onto them. So she was looking at it from that perspective. What do people feel? What do they experience? What are the common elements of it? This sense of having euphoria when things are going well, feeling devastated, so your mood swings into a depression if things are going badly, anxiety about being with them, so heart racing and sweaty palms and all those kinds of symptoms, and an aching sensation in the chest, and intrusive thoughts that you can't always control, a sense that it's involuntary, so as though you have been struck by some external force, And so that was all how she approached it, taking testimony from people, trying to kind of put it together. And she was kind of a bit of a Renaissance woman in that she drew in a lot of, literature and history and poetry and things like this as well to try and capture the whole experience. My perspective as an academic and a research scientist was quite different. I was thinking, well, what's going on in your brain? So, what are the mechanisms that regulate euphoria? Why are some desires so powerful that they've become irresistible? Essentially, it feels as though you can't resist. What is it that regulates the transition from feeling wonderful bliss and excitement and possibility and, like you're buzzing, into the anxiety and the feeling, wrung out and stressed and like it's not even necessarily enjoyable anymore, but you still want this person with a relentless intensity. And so that brings in concepts around addiction, that when you get into a state of wanting somebody so intensely that you feel you can't resist it and everything else in your life becomes secondary to it, that's the realm of addiction. And so really what we have now compared to what Tennov had when she was first working is that extra material on, or what are the fundamental mechanisms of reward? What are the fundamental mechanisms of arousal, excitement, euphoria? And what are the processes that regulate the transition from just really enjoying something and really enjoying somebody's company and getting that buzz to feeling compelled, the compulsions, the obsession, the inability to turn the thoughts off, even when you want to.
Oh, that's so interesting. So correct my understanding if I'm wrong. Is it the case that some people would be more predisposed to having this experience if there is a neurobiological aspect to it? Are some people more prone to addiction and then therefore would be more likely to fall into this kind of limerent pattern of thinking?
Yeah. So, it's a big question, and it's something that can't be easily disentangled, but certainly some people have a predisposition towards addiction. We don't altogether understand why. And the problem with trying to understand it is that brains are plastic to an extent, so they wire themselves. And so over the course of your life, you'll be having all kinds of experiences that will influence the way that your brain develops. And so it is truly impossible to disentangle completely nature from nurture, because you'll have, the genes that you're born with will determine a lot about the way that your brain develops, but it's also influenced by the experiences that you have. Naturally, we are integrated into our environment and we respond to it, and our brains learn lessons as we develop that determine the way that they end up. When you're thinking in terms of an adult seeking a romantic connection, everything, all the genes, all of the experiences through life are going to have shaped how your brain is operating under those particular conditions. But there certainly are people that have, a predisposition towards addiction. And in terms of limerence, I ran a survey on my site trying to get an estimate for the number of people in the general population who have experienced the sensation of limerence. And it's very hard to get an unbiased sample of people to answer a questionnaire about love. I took a polling firm, so-called Pollfish, who are sort of actually really a marketing firm, but they will send out, they've got a whole database of people that they will send out surveys to. And so I tried to use that as the best unbiased estimate I could get for it. And if anyone is interested in the details and the numbers, they are all on the site. But the best estimate we have is that about 50 to 60% of people have experienced limerence at some point in their life. And of that 50 to 60%, about half of them have limerent so badly that it affects their lives, that it causes distress and it disrupts their lives. So you might say, of the 50 to 60% who've experienced limerence, about half of them get to the point of person addiction that is so bad that it becomes disruptive.
It sort of echoes the conversations that I've had with people about this particular topic. And I wanted to ask too, like, my experience, or when I first came across this word, was actually during COVID. And
Right.
it was, so it was at a point where it was like I'd been doing a lot of online dating, but I hadn't been communicating with people frequently. And I think I got kind of, like quite a sort of compulsive set of thoughts about a particular person. And I hadn't really experienced it before. But I was wondering do you feel that the circumstances around COVID, like the isolation and I guess the social uncertainty caused by using like tech devices and tech tools, do you think that almost like primes our mind to put us into this kind of mental space where it's more possible that we are going to ruminate, idolize, and fantasize?
Yeah, definitely. So I already said, your genes are going to influence your propensity to limerence. Your life experience is going to as well. And on top of that is literally what's happening to you, in your day-to-day life. So you do hear I do hear from limerents who've had an uptick in exactly that kind of scenario. So where they're feeling isolated, as we all were during lockdowns for COVID. Another common trigger is grief, or a major life stress like illness, or bereavement, or redundancy, or something like that. So I think an element of that is that people who are prone to limerence learn fairly early on that it feels great to think about the person that they're infatuated with their limerent object, and to ruminate about it. It's like a sort of secondary hit. And so most of us limerents learn over time that this is a very effective way of repairing mood. So if you are struggling with mood, there is a reliable source of reward and pleasure and comfort in fantasizing about romantic possibilities, fantasizing about this other person. And so almost as a coping strategy, you can use limerent reverie and rumination for mood regulation. And so when you do have periods of stress in life, that is a kind of go-to coping mechanism that many of us have learned. And so that can enhance it. Quite apart from just the obvious thing of starting a new romantic adventure with somebody, exciting and euphoric and delirious, is a massive, wonderful relief from the bad things that are happening in your life. So it does offer that potential for escape and that potential for reward.
Yes, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that was actually what I suppose kicked off this kind of, I guess it was a bit of an obsession with this person. I was journaling about them, and I was aware of the fact that they usually tell you not to take your thoughts too far. I can't remember what the exact phrase is, but, don't get too invested in someone, from the get-go. But I was kind of curious. I was like, yeah, but this feels good. feels good to think about this person. So I'm like, oh, what will happen if I paint like this huge fantasy in my diary and maybe I'll manifest it. And I think that feeling and that high from, scaffolding out this reality with that person, it really kicked it off, because what I noticed from that point in was every time I was waiting for a text or I was uncertain about, what was going on with them, it was just, as you said, like the rumination would take over. And, I often kind of think to myself, like, if my mind was a pie chart, what is taking up most of the space? And they were getting like,
99.
90%. Exactly. You're like, the grocery list is barely catching a glance. And it's a really strange phenomenon, because it feels like once the train's sort of going, you can't really get off.
Yeah, and I think if we just follow our instincts, they lead you deeper into limerence. I mean, that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned from now thinking about limerence, writing about limerence for 7 or 8 years. If you just follow your instinct and your intuition, it will very naturally lead you deeper into limerence. And so it's great, interesting to hear what you're saying about that, because you feel like, well, then this feels good. This feels like I'm, getting somewhere positive. I'm enjoying this, and there's easy rationalizations as to why I should continue doing this positive thing. And it might transform my life, and it might make life better. And, I can imagine an ideal future that's very appealing. And so that leads you into the habit that ultimately do reinforce limerence. And, I'm not anti-limerence. I'm glad that I am a limerent, because I really enjoy the early phase of limerence. But there are times in life when it is destructive. It becomes a destructive force. If you become limerent for somebody who's just not right for you, it's just inappropriate or unavailable. Or if you are already in a committed relationship that's happy and you become limerent for somebody outside that relationship, then obviously it can become a destructive force. And so that tends to be when limerence goes from the sort of euphoria, what feels like an enormous natural high, to becoming something that is much more like an addiction, with cravings and intrusive thoughts and, mood swings, and just a sense of feeling trapped in an obsession that you can't control anymore. And so, that is an unfortunate consequence of just us following our natural instincts, is that you end up going further and further along that road and through the phases of limerence towards an addiction that can become much more destructive. So I think, an element of learning how to live well if you do have limerence is recognizing the opportunities to sort of escape early on, before the addiction has become too profound or too strong along the road. And so kind of learning to recognize those moments where you're kind of crossing a threshold into a new phase, and then making the sort of purposeful choice to stop if you don't want to be limerent for that person.
Yeah, I read that in your blog, and I thought that was so interesting, and it was such a nice warning, and maybe you could break down what are some of the warning signs that you might be developing that feeling of limerence towards someone, so that if someone is stepping towards that edge, they'll know to turn back, unless, they want to go for the ride.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said, I'm not anti-limerent. It could be, it can be a fantastic ride. You just need to know what you're doing, what you're letting yourself in for. So, I mean, the earliest stage of limerence is something that I call the glimmer. So the idea behind that is that most limerents realize that they can learn to spot somebody who's a potential limerent object fairly early on. So there's something indescribable about them that connects with you. It's like a kind of special romantic potency. And I often wonder if it's the same thing where people talk about a spark on a date, or there was no spark, or there was a real spark on a date. I think it might be the same phenomenon that you recognize there's something about that person that's connecting with you at a very deep level, and that they seem unusually attractive, not just, they're beautiful or handsome or whatever. It's like there is something about them, some potency about them. And that, I think, is telling you that they are connecting with a subconscious template or archetype that you have about what an attractive romantic partner is like, what a potential mate is like. And so that stage one, essentially, is that moment of recognition that this is a person that I could become infatuated with. This is a person that could become a limerent object. The second phase really is the good one, where if you do get to spend more time with them, and enjoy their company, and you get that natural high, you get butterflies, you get tingling in the fingers, your heart's racing, you're just getting that sense of excitement about the possibility. And that can get to the point of euphoria, particularly if you sense reciprocation from them. So if you think, I think they might be interested in me as well, if you sense some sort of attraction back from them, that can really escalate things. The other element there, so that's kind of hope that they might feel the same way. The other thing that really supercharges limerence is uncertainty. So you've got some hope, you felt a glimmer for them, you've got some hope, but there's some uncertainty around it. And normally that's just kind of built in, unless you are a supremely confident person who is just going to, forthrightly say what they feel and pursue opportunities. Most of us are a bit hesitant. Most of us, take a bit of time, try to see how things are, and are a bit more guarded. So there's some uncertainty built into just being a bit decisive. But if there are other barriers, or if, this other person is kind of giving mixed messages, so sometimes they seem really into you, other times they're cold, or, they're like really enthusiastic about going on a date, but then they cancel it an hour before, things like that. That can really send your mind into overdrive, because you're trying to understand. Already this was somebody that you were very interested in, had your attention, but now you're trying to solve the puzzle of, well, are they interested in me or are they not? Is this a possibility or is it not? And so you begin the rumination and things like that. So then I define the third stage after that kind of initial exciting positive phase as fixation. So that's the point at which they are fully occupying your mind. You're really invested in trying to get a relationship with them, or at least trying to stay connected to them. And that's when the ruminations start to feel a little bit out of your control, and that you can't turn them off, and you're finding it hard to concentrate on other things, because you're, everything, like you're trying to read a book, but a thought will jump in about them and you can't concentrate on the book anymore. You're now thinking about them, and I've got to go and check their Facebook page and, see if they've updated it recently. And so that is I think that's the key transition point, because that's when you're starting to get fixated, obsessed, rather than just enjoying the buzz and enjoying the energy and the, exhilaration of the early stage. If when you're in that fixation phase, you aren't able to really properly resolve the situation, so the uncertainty persists. And I mean, classic examples of this would be that they're married, or you're married, or they're your boss, or for whatever reason, you're not able to express yourself openly. That can then move into what you might think of as a later stage of addiction. I call that the desperation phase. So that's when it now feels mostly negative, that you're just wrung out, you're emotionally exhausted. It's mostly about wanting to relieve that distress. So instead of feeling excited about connecting with them, you're now just desperate for relief from the sort of negative emotions and negative feelings. And so you're craving connection. And often in that phase, limerents tend to kind of escalate their behavior. So they start being a bit more erratic, sort of trying to declare themselves, but in a very, indirect way. So dropping heavy hints and things like this to try and precipitate some kind of response. And that phase feels terrible, just like any advanced addiction does. You're no longer really even enjoying the sensation, but you still desperately want that connection, that hit. And then finally, slightly more positively, limerence does eventually end. I've heard about very long, limerence lasting for years and years and years, but that tends to be where people are kind of almost actively reinforcing it and keeping it going through their behavior. But eventually limerence will end and you will go into a recovery phase where you come back to your right mind and wonder what the hell possessed you, what you were doing. How often, again, another very common experience is after limerence has finally passed, people do wonder, what on earth did I see in them? That they're just an ordinary person and I'd elevated them to this romantic ideal and they can't see it anymore. And so they wonder what on earth happened and what possessed them. So there we go. Sorry, very long and rambling description of the process of limerence. Yeah.
No. It's so interesting. It's so funny to me just trying to, what I find peculiar about it is imagining how many people are going through this and how many people's minds are really occupied with this, because it seems like one of those things where the more you speak to people about this concept, the more you find out that other people have been tangled up in aspects of this experience. And it's, kind of fascinating to think about how many people's minds are occupied with other people just on the day to day.
Yeah, I think it's quite a lot. I mean, if round about half, possibly slightly more than half of people have experienced the sensation, then there's going to be a lot of people out there going through this, at any stage. And I tend to hear from the people who are really suffering, so the people who are deep in the fixation or desperation phase come to my site and, looking for support. And so, there's about 100,000 people a month come to the site to read the articles and to get the guides and the support there. So yes, it's not a small problem. It's significant.
Yeah, and that was so interesting too when I was looking through the comments on your website, because you have some really devoted people who are really pouring their hearts out, and then you have people supporting the other people and sharing their experiences. Like the community around this particular, I don't want to call it a problem, a phenomenon, or an internal kind of experience was huge on your website. The vulnerability and the depth of what people wrote was really, really fascinating, because there was a lot of people in a lot of pain because of this.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole origin of the site was essentially that, that I was going through that pain. So I was experiencing unwanted limerence and trying to recover from it and trying to make sense of what was happening to me and trying to kind of find a route out. And so I started, writing the blog almost as an exorcism, to try and get out some of the feelings that I'd been going through and tell other people what I'd learned, essentially, about what was going on from the perspective of neuroscience. And so I started the blog anonymously. When I began it, I just took a pseudonym of Dr. L, and so I wrote it anonymously originally. And I think that is part of why the community is so thriving, because people feel naturally a bit embarrassed, more than a bit, often, about their behavior and what they're going through. And it's hard to find kind of trusted advisors in your life that you would share something like this with. I'm going through all of these emotions and I can't regulate them and I don't know what to do and I'm worried that my life's going to fall apart and I need to get away from them, but I also don't want to get away from them. So I want this to end, but I don't want it to end. And I feel like I can't control it. I mean, that's one of the things. So if you were looking for a sign that you've gone too far, and so that you were kind of well into the fixation phase, I would say it's those moments when you have a thought about your limerent object and you think, well, I want to, check their Facebook, check their social media, whatever. And there's a quiet voice in your mind that says you shouldn't do this. And then there's a much stronger voice that says, yeah, but you're gonna. And that shift from when, if you like, your executive control, the CEO who should be in charge of your life and who's giving you a warning, that starts getting very quiet. And you just have that sense of, I know I'm not going to be able to resist this urge. I'm just going to go with it. And so you then, start online stalking your limerent object or whatever it is, even if it's just sort of taking some time to go and daydream. That moment when you start to recognize, okay, I know that the limerent urge is too strong for me to resist. And I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I can't stop myself. And there's a part of me that is glad that I can't stop myself, because then I get more of my drug, I get more of that hit. So I'd say that is a really good indicator of you've gone to the point where your reward system within your brain and the executive feedback control that should be regulating your behavior, your reward seeking behavior, has got unbalanced. And the reward drive, the wanting drive, is out of control, and the executive is either too weak or it's no longer cares. It's just rationalizing away your behavior, if you like, so that you get more of your supply. So I think having the anonymity on the site and people being able to just come and say, this is what happened to me, behind that, it is a public blog, so all of it's out there, it's in public for anybody to read, but people can talk about things that they have never shared with other people in their lives, because they wouldn't want other people in their lives to know what was going on, this sort of internal battle. But they do find kindred spirits, if you like, on the site that they can relate to. And yeah, I have a fantastic community of commenters, and I'm very grateful.
Yeah, it is really beautiful. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but would you be willing to share a little bit more about your story? Or is that...
So a little, not about the details. So I don't want to seem, offhand, but it's quite a cliched story in some respects. So I'm very happily married, and I was limerent for my wife when we first met, and we actually had mutual limerence. So both of us are limerents, and we got that mutual bliss at the very beginning. So it was fantastic. So I'd never sort of really thought about anything other than, well, that's just love. That's what love feels like. It feels fantastic. It feels amazing. That's how you know that you're in love with somebody, is you get these enormous fireworks and excitement and so on. And so we got married, had children, and a very happy marriage. But then in midlife, I, as a complete cliche, developed limerence for a coworker. And I didn't want it. I didn't seek it. It was almost from the beginning, even though I was obviously enjoying the sensation of feeling, oh gosh, I'm getting the excitement and the exhilaration and the euphoria and so on. That voice in my mind was always there and fairly strong, saying, this isn't good. This is destructive. You need to handle this, not just pursue this, because it could jeopardize, everything that you care about. And so I never told my coworker anything about my feelings. I never disclosed it. I did tell my wife. So I kind of managed to reorient it into us together as a partnership dealing with a problem, rather than me feeling alone and, these two sides of a triangle and being pulled between them. I knew that was psychologically bad. So I very much, if you like, aligned with my wife to say, I need a champion help, but that was the overall experience. And I think it's a very common one, that at midlife, you do tend to start to question things, well, I've got my career, I've got settled, I'm, in this stage, how do I feel about the choices that I made? And you start to realize opportunities are vanishing. I will never be an astronaut, that kind of thing. And so it inevitably does become a season of life where you're questioning the choices that you made and so on. And I think people become more vulnerable to the possibility of other romantic adventures at that stage.
Yeah. Oh, well, firstly, thank you for that level of detail. That actually does paint a really clear picture. And yeah, it's very vulnerable and brave and generous of you to share that story. Because, yeah, as you said, I can imagine so many people are having that experience. Because my understanding is like, I guess life does become not repetitive, but I guess like you have to fulfill on particular obligations. And I'm guessing that like the feeling of something new would reignite like a sense of dopamine. And I don't know, maybe it is quite difficult to spark that in your mind without something like new in the mix, or what's your sense around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, so you can rationalize it intellectually as, well, I was at this life stage and, that's a time of change, and people talk about, that last gasp, you start to recognize signs of aging, and you think, well, I've got one last opportunity, to seize, to go in a different direction and have a different romantic life. But none of that was conscious. It was completely unexpected. I wasn't looking. I didn't feel restless. It just was the unlucky circumstance of working with somebody who was a match for my kind of Limerent template that was built into my mind. And so it started without me kind of seeking it or thinking about it or processing any of that. It just came upon me. And again, I think this is why many Limerents conceptualize it as being almost like, Cupid's arrow or a love potion, or you're hit by a thunderbolt. I once said this on the site. I said, do people have this experience of being hit by Cupid's arrow? One of my commenters said it was more like a meteorite. So that's it. It just comes out of nowhere when you have that connection. So I wasn't aware of this. Who knows what's going on in the dark recesses of the subconscious? But for me, it just felt like chance. And so even though you can make sense of the experience in retrospect of everything that you're going through in your life and everything that kind of all of the factors around the experience that you can think in retrospect, well, that would have contributed to it and that would have contributed to it. That feels like trying after the event to explain it. When I was in the middle of it, it just was, there's just this other person here and they're starting the fireworks going. And if they hadn't been there, my life would have carried on potentially much more stable and secure.
Yeah,
But then I
that
wouldn't
makes
have started the blog, and I wouldn't have now got to the stage where I'm doing this full time, so this has become my life.
Yeah, and you're helping a lot of people too, and I guess I really like that you're, like, really highlighting that, because I guess that means for the person who's going through the experience and maybe the person who has to have the experience explained to them, there's kind of empathy at both parts, because no one's asking to enter into this experience. And then for the person who might be in a relationship with them, I guess then they can understand too that it's not personal. It's not that there's like a lack. It's
Yeah.
just something that's been sparked through that other person. And it's
Yeah. So easily the most distressing emails that I get are from people whose partner has become limerent for somebody else and broken up the relationship because they can't make sense of what's happened. That this person that was loving, supportive, caring has suddenly apparently undergone a complete personality change and become hostile and secretive and evasive. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why thinking about limerence from the perspective of addiction is so useful, because it is almost like that you've lost your partner to an addiction, that they aren't thinking rationally, they aren't thinking clearly, they are trying to reconcile the fact that they've become limerent for somebody else despite having committed to you, their partner. And unfortunately, most people don't make sense of that cognitive dissonance of I'm feeling all these wonderful feelings for this new person, despite the fact that I love my old partner and I profess my love and my commitment. They don't make sense of that as, oh, I'm not as morally strong as I thought I was because I'm being tempted and I'm struggling to resist that temptation. They make sense of it by saying, rewriting history, well, I was never really happy in the relationship, or, well, my spouse doesn't really meet my needs. And, well, this feels so strong that this is, different rules apply. This is true love. This is extra special. So that means the commitments that I made before I knew that this was possible don't really count. They don't really apply anymore because I didn't know what love could feel like, and these are all things that I hear a lot from people that are going through this. And so that is a very, very difficult situation to deal with, to put it mildly, where your partner has become limerent for somebody else and is now devaluing you and devaluing the previous relationship. And it sends you, obviously people have, nervous breakdowns over this. It's one of the most stressful things that can happen in your life. And again, I think conceptualizing limerence as addiction and thinking about it in those terms really does help the spouses who are suffering make more sense of what's going on. You could think, just in a sort of direct analogy, that if your spouse starts to develop a alcohol habit or something like that, they're drinking too much and their behavior's changing and they're getting mean and they're doing, they are changing. Their personality is changing as a consequence of the addiction. So it does, again, help, I think, make sense of it, to look on it in those terms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of scary though to think about, isn't it? That it could just kind of happen and break apart the relationship that you're in.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And again, thinking to my own experience, I had two big advantages. One was that I was a neuroscientist, so I could understand the processes at a kind of fundamental level, at the level of neurochemistry, and these connections are getting strengthened and these connections are getting weakened, and it's because of the behavior that you're doing. And so I had that theoretical background to understand it. The other big advantage was that my wife was a limerent as well. So I could talk to her about what was happening and she could understand because she'd been through it. And so we were then able to have some frank conversations about that, both of our experiences with limerence, through the marriage. And so that was a huge advantage. Whereas if your partner has suddenly become limerent and you've never experienced that phenomenon, it's very hard to get your head around what's going on. Because if you've never been that sort of completely head over heels infatuated with somebody, you can't make sense of what your partner's talking about, what they're saying is happening to them, and what's going on, because you've never experienced it. So there's literally no kind of frame of reference for you to make sense of why they would be so, insanely over the top infatuated with this other person.
Yeah, that also makes a lot of sense. And I guess my mind's now thinking about, if you are someone who's maybe prone to this kind of thought pattern, I guess the more that you can educate yourself about it before it happens, the better you'll be able to navigate it, because then you can have that open dialogue surrounding it. Because it does often come up for me, and I think for a lot of people, like, what does happen in a long-term relationship if someone's feelings change, and how do you handle it? But I guess just preparing with knowledge and conversations is the best course to take. What do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, but self-awareness is kind of the most powerful thing. That if you understand better about yourself and your drives and where they've come from and how your experiences in life have shaped you, so you can start to recognize, okay, these triggers make me angry, or these triggers make me want to rescue, this other person, or these triggers make me insecure, make me feel anxious about, the strength of the relationship. Building up that kind of self-awareness about your subconscious drives and triggers allows you to respond to them and in an appropriate way and recognize them. So there's this idea of what's called metacognition, where you become aware of your thoughts. So it's almost like there's two layers of awareness. There's the thoughts that you're thinking and the feelings that you're having. And then there's you looking at it going, oh, that's interesting. That's a limerent urge. And so you can feel the urge and you can, be impelled to take action. But if you're able to have that level of conscious awareness above it, to say, oh no, that was a limerent urge, and I've decided I don't want to act on limerent urges, even that can be enough to kind of disrupt the habit loop of just sort of pursuing the subconscious drive. So
Yeah.
being aware of the fact that people experience early love in different ways is incredibly powerful, because a lot of romantic misadventures come from not recognizing that people experience love differently early on. And so people will respond to the same situation in a very different way.
Is it the case that when you have a relationship with someone, will the sense of limerence always fade? Or is it something that you can prolong through certain actions or activities with your partner?
So the typical time range for limerence, there's again a lot of debate about how long limerence can last, but it's usually given as around about 18 months. But the things that do help speed up the resolution of limerence is either getting a very clear no, so that it takes away the uncertainty and the ambiguity. So if you are just open, I'm really attracted to you, I think you're great, would you be interested in, a romantic relationship? If they say, well, thank you very much, but no, in a very clear and unambiguous way, that can help resolve the limerence, because it's taken the uncertainty away. Hope is, removed, essentially. The fantasies aren't nearly as rewarding if but they told me absolutely that it's not going to happen, because, you do eventually give up on it. And so that can stop the limerence from getting too advanced. So actually, as a general strategy, in the early stages of limerence, if you don't want it to go to addiction, being completely open and honest with your limerent object about what you're feeling and what you want, and not trying to stay as a friend on the side, but looking for a possible opportunity and opening and things like that. You just be forthright and just be open about it, and say that can stop limerence. But the other thing is reciprocation. So, consummation. So if you do actually form a relationship or, romantic connection with your limerent object, it will fade. because you satisfy the desire, you have got the reward, you've got everything that you wanted. You'll get that honeymoon period of a few months. And again, a lot of people speculate it's coincidentally the amount of time needed to conceive a child and get them through childbirth and get the most vulnerable early stage. So it's a way of cementing a pair bond, a very strong pair bond between people for long enough for them to conceive a child. It will then fade. So the things that keep limerence alive are uncertainty and hope, not being satisfied.
I wanted to ask you about one of the articles that I read, and you were speaking about polyamory, and you were talking about relationship dynamics and the history behind them. Would you mind distilling down some of the information surrounding that and the role of pairs?
Sure. So people often do ask about polyamory and limerence. I'm wary about it because it often feels like a strategy for the limerent to try and have their cake and eat it. So I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but a limerent who's desperate, who's thinking, well, I don't want to leave my partner, but I can't stop these feelings for this other person. It does seem perfectly rational to then say, well, how about we have a 3-person relationship and we open up the marriage or form a kind of polyamorous connection so that they can maintain all of the benefits of the relationship, but also still have contact with their limerent object. And my caution about that is it sounds like an alcoholic, trying to justify their habit, well, I'm just a social drinker, or, it's trying to find a way to resolve a conflict by, kind of changing the agreement about what the relationship structure was going to be. But of course, monogamy isn't for everybody, and it isn't. It's a very contentious debate whether or not monogamy is natural and whether or not marriage is more about a kind of social contract and a sort of institution to regulate people's behavior. And all of those arguments have merit. From a kind of, I suppose, an evolutionary perspective, humans are unusual in practicing social monogamy. So almost all human civilizations that have been looked at have some sort of social monogamy rules or, habits or traditions around them. And humans do form pair bonds. One of the arguments for why humans form pair bonds is that human women, again, are unusual compared to other primates in not signaling fertility. And so actually to secure conception, a couple needs to be together for some time, regularly mating, in order to get that opportune window, that moment when conception can occur. So, women don't have estrus in the way that, chimpanzees or bonobos do. So they're not clearly fertile at particular periods of their cycle. And again, there's a lot of debate about, well, why did that happen? What's the consequence of that? Why, would evolution select for that? And I think the best theory seems to be this idea of what's called fitness interdependence. So both men and women benefit from forming a pair bond in terms of it's a secure way of conceiving a child and protecting a child, and human babies are very vulnerable through an early period, and distributing labor and distributing, resources and all of that. It works very effectively as a reproductive strategy to have that kind of fitness interdependence. And that doesn't exclude the fact that you still will be attracted to other people, you will still feel lust towards other people, that the temptation is still going to be there. And in fact, if you sort of look at the anthropological literature, and even if you look at other animal species that practice social monogamy, the reason the word social is there is because there is still a fair amount of opportunistic infidelity, because the kind of, from the perspective of a gene, if you like, the best chance for genes to be reproduced is that secure pair bond in which both partners are committed, and so the child gets the best opportunity to grow and thrive. But also, if other opportunities present themselves on the side, grab them, take those opportunities as well. So from that perspective, we kind of are built for wanting to form a pair bond, and also we are built so that there are the idea of infidelity or opportunities for opportunistic mating are still appealing as well. And again, we could go into the neuroscience of that. It's a little bit convoluted, but the quick summary of the neuroscience is that the drives are separate. So lust is almost a completely separate system from bonding in the brain.
Oh, wow.
So the bonding system is that thing that helps you feel connected. So you probably heard of oxytocin. There's another neuropeptide hormone called vasopressin as well, and they both seem to be involved in pro-social drives. So the desire to form connections and intimacy and feeling good when you belong as part of a tribe, and feeling terrible when you're excluded or ostracized. And if you can have a situation where the reward system and the bonding system are activated together, that seems to cement a pair bond. So if you have the combination of the reward with a partner and the sense of bonding with them, that will reinforce the power of the reward, make them even more desirable and more rewarding, and cement that pair bond. But the lust system is almost entirely separate at a physiological level from that, so it can still just get activated by the same stimuli as, regardless of it. And so the drive to mate, to form a pair bond, and the drive to copulate are not. They overlap, of course, and there's some commonality, but at the level of the brain, they're quite separate systems.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so if you are starting to experience the feeling of limerence towards someone, which system is the one that's being activated?
So there's three key systems. So there's the arousal system. So that's what gets you all hyped up and excited and stimulated. So that's mostly about noradrenaline signaling, norepinephrine in the US. And then there's the reward system, and that's dopamine. So that's what makes you want things. So it helps you to recognize rewards, to learn what things in the environment are rewarding, and then it drives you to seek that reward. And that's the process that gets really strengthened during addiction, is that drive to want something. And then the third system is the bonding system. So that feeling of a really unique, special connection to the other person that is much more important and powerful to you than a friendship. Even though friendships, of course, are wonderful, it's not the same order of magnitude as the limerent desire for bonding.
Mm. Oh, that's so interesting. And yeah, I just wanted to ask too, because what role do you see as something like writing playing in breaking down like the metacognition patterns that happen in association with this? Because my experience at least was journaling and trying to get clear on the narrative that I'd created around the person was helpful. But what's your feeling? Like what tools and resources do people have? So there's self-awareness, and then how can they tap into that self-awareness if this is something that they're experiencing and they do recognize that it's probably something chemically that's going on inside of them?
Writing is very interesting, again, from a neuroscience perspective, that combining the motor action of writing with the cognitive processes of thinking through something strengthens memories in a way that just thinking doesn't. So activating the motor cortex and the motor centers of the brain at the same time as you're thinking through things and processing ideas really helps to cement it. And I think many people have that experience of once they start writing something, the ideas, it's like a uncorking, that the ideas start flowing more freely because you're engaged in a physical act as well. I was used to bore my students at the university with this, saying, if you actually handwrite your note rather than just watching the PowerPoint slides, you'll remember it better. But it's true. So that does obviously engage a lot more of your brain during the process. So I could definitely see that being beneficial. I think there is some value to looking back through your past to try and understand what it is that triggers the glimmer for you. And I think probably that's the single most useful thing that any individual can do, is to try and make sense of what is it that's triggering me? What is it that I'm seeing in these other people that makes me feel drawn towards them? And you might not get to the bottom of, what it was in your past, your childhood experience or your adolescence or whatever, that shaped that. But at least beginning to see a pattern of the kinds of people that trigger you, that can be very useful. And that's somewhere, again, where narratives and stories can be extremely, valuable, useful for making sense of what you're going through, because often people will recognize they're drawn to archetypes. Like, I'm drawn to, the bad boy or the damsel in distress or the mentor figure or something like that, that they'll see that there are, that it's very idiosyncratic what your individual triggers will be, but you can start to get an idea of what it is that you find romantically potent. And that's useful for a lot of reasons, both just becoming more self-aware, but it also helps you understand whether or not limerence is going to be a net positive or net negative force in your life. Because if your limerent triggers are things like dark hair or blue eyes or a dry sense of humor or, somebody who seems strong, reliable together, those are largely neutral in terms of predicting whether this is a person that would make a good long-term partner, whether this is somebody that I'm going to, be able to have a healthy, thriving relationship with. But if you start to realize that your triggers are less neutral, so things like I'm always attracted to unavailable people or people that treat me badly or, an authority figure who shouldn't be, indulging in romantic, there's some duty of care or something that means they shouldn't form a romantic connection. There can be triggers like that for people. And so if they do just pursue their limerent urges and follow that instinct, they're going to repeatedly become infatuated with individuals that are not a good, healthy connection for them if what they're looking for is a long-term relationship. And so that, I think, is probably the single most useful thing that you can do to understand how limerence has affected your life and will affect your future.
That also makes so much sense. And do you feel that there's any value in looking at the patterns and the people that you form like limerent feelings towards and the patterns in the relationships that you have with your parents? How often do you see some kind of connection between those two things?
I'll I'm not sure I've done a study to give you a number on that. One of the things that limerence is often connected to is attachment theory. So this is this idea of how our attachment and our relationship with our early caregivers, which is for most people their parents, influences their development, literally their neurodevelopment, and later relationships, and the way that they attach to other people in later relationships. And limerence is often explained as an attachment disorder or a consequence of having what's called an anxious attachment style. Now, there really is a very strong correlation. So when I was doing my survey, I did ask people, would you say you have an anxious attachment style? And I gave them a brief description of what anxious attachment was. And when I broke down the numbers on it, for people that don't have an anxious attachment style, so they form secure relationships in adulthood, or they are avoidant, which is another attachment style, so they try to limit their connection to somebody else. They're resistant to intimacy, and they don't want to feel entangled with somebody. They want to keep their independence. So for secure or avoidant styles, I think the number was 55% of those people had experienced limerence. For people that had an anxious attachment style, 79% had experienced limerence. So there clearly is a correlation between anxious attachment and the likelihood that you will experience limerence. But, and I always emphasize this because I personally have a secure attachment style, it's not required to experience limerence. So if you try to understand your limerence from the perspective of anxious attachment, when you don't actually have an anxious attachment style, it won't feel right. It won't be true. It won't be authentic for you. But if you do have an anxious attachment style, it is then likely that you will also experience limerence. So that probably is telling us something about the brain regions that will be involved and the particular nuances of how people with anxious attachment are different from people with secure attachment, and limerence from non-limerence. So certainly looking at your past, looking at your relationship with your parents can help you make sense of the factors that trigger a sense of security or insecurity in you, and therefore perhaps how that influences the people that you become limerent for as an adult.
That makes sense. And so if you are someone who has an anxious attachment style, do you think that you can, I guess, set yourself up contextually to make it less likely that you have the experience by trying to surround yourself by other kinds of close connections? Or do you think that limerence is not contextual, it's just something that happens because of who's in front of you? Or do you think the context that sits around you can play a role?
It will certainly help play a role in the kinds of people that you're interacting with. And so therefore, if you like, the people that you're exposing yourself to. It might be wise for somebody that's aware of their anxious attachment style, if they are developing limerence for somebody, to try and moderate the intensity of the experience, because they will compound each other. So it is a part of the limerent experience that if the person that you're infatuated with begins to sort of withdraw or seem a bit cold, that will cause anxiety, and it will trigger the limerent to try and secure more reciprocation. Now, exactly the same thing is going to be happening with anxious attachment, but more on the sort of threat sense of feeling intense anxiety about losing that bond, about losing that connection. So they'll be compounding each other. And so, unfortunately, for people that do have an anxious attachment style, the two things have to be managed simultaneously. So maybe it would be, and this is just speculation, but maybe favoring or leaning towards relationships that develop out of friendship, where you've already got some connection with that person and you've got some security, rather than pursuing people that give you the explosive fireworks at the beginning. That might lead to a better outcome, but obviously it's going to be totally dependent on the two individuals. There are many, many factors that determine relationship success. So,
yeah, no, that makes sense too. Thank you. And I guess just to close, if someone is experiencing limerence or they have a partner who's experiencing limerence, what are the resources that you direct them to on your website? You've got, such a slew of things. What's the best place for people to start investigating and really understanding more about this topic?
So yeah, if you do go to the livingwithlimerence.com site, there is a page, you can see at the top menu for resources. And so that lays out all of the resources that we do have. There's a couple of ebooks that are free. If you sign up for my newsletter, they're free. And so one for spouses, it's called Anxiety to Action. So that's the sort of steps to make sense of what's happening and constructive things that you can do as a spouse to try and help the situation. And for limerence, there's an ebook called Take Control, which is like 10 steps for getting control of the infatuation, and steps, practical things that you can do to try and reverse the habits and the behaviors that are reinforcing the limerence and pull yourself back and get kind of a bit more emotional equilibrium so that you can make better decisions.
Yeah,
So those are the two key resources on the site. There's also the community as well. And I have just launched a YouTube channel. So you can follow me on YouTube at Dr. Tom Bellamy, and I'm working through the fundamentals of limerence on that in video form there as well.
Oh, brilliant. All right. I'll definitely put links to all of that. And I kind of regret not asking you this sooner, but we've touched on it already, but just to really articulate it. So what is the difference between love and limerence? So you said that you can be limerent for your partner in the first stages of love, but yeah, how would you crystallize the two things, love versus limerence?
So love is an umbrella term for a lot of things, a lot of different kinds of relationships and a lot of different life experiences. I think everybody has their own idea of what love is. And I think limerents tend to assume that the experience of limerence is the indication that they are falling in love. And that's true to an extent. I think the word limerence and the concept of limerence is useful because it picks out a particular mental state and a particular experience that about half of us have in the early stages of romantic attraction and romantic love. But love also has to capture everything, in terms of affectional bonding and, there's familial love. The Greeks had sort of 7 or 8 forms of love. And so there is a distinction in my mind between affectional bonding, the kind of love that you feel for somebody who you care for, who's cared for you, who you've built bonds of intimacy over time. And that clearly is distinct from limerence. You can't develop that without the time and the labor, and it can be wonderful, beautiful labor, but it's still work, to all those moments of care and those moments of support and moments of intimacy that really builds love out, So I think of love as encompassing kind of everything, and limerence is just a little slither at the beginning that some people experience, but not everybody experiences.
That makes sense.
I don't know if that helps. It's such a hard thing to do to describe love because you have love for friends, you have love for children, you have love for parents, you have love for your partner, your spouse, you have romantic love, you have sexual love, you have all of these different forms that it takes, and yet somehow we recognize it's all linked together. And I think that's all of the things that can cause that feeling of bonding, all of the things that can cause arousal and reward, and all of that together could be conceived as love. Limerence is a much more specific and detailed thing.
That makes so much sense, and it makes me loop back to why the word object's involved in the description. Because I guess if it is that deeper love, the person is no longer an object because you know them so deeply. It's not a story that's attached to them as something that's, quite distant.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think you can feel true affectional love until the limerence has started to fade, because you're so overwhelmed by the fireworks. And something I wrote on the site once was to understand, in terms of your life and in terms of life purpose, well, what's more valuable? Should you just pursue limerent relationships over time? And I think it is the difference between firework and a fire in the hearth. That you can heat your home with a fire, but you can't heat your home with fireworks. It's limerence is the drive to form the bond, but love lasts, after the bond is formed.
Wow. That is a beautiful note to end on, and I really love that metaphor. Thank you. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening conversation, and I think, it's really nice that you're trying to spread the word, because it gives people such a sense of ease to know that they're not crazy. This is actually a really common thing that they're experiencing.
Yeah, I think making sense of it is really my driving force. Trying to understand it, and help other people understand it as well.
Okay, so the conversation, of course, continued, but that is all we have time for today. If you want to see any more of Dr. Bellamy's work, please do check out his website and his YouTube channel. It is such a well of resources. And as we touched on in the podcast, his community is so strong. And I found it so fascinating reading through the comments and seeing the support that people offer other people in the community, but also the level of vulnerability that people in his community show up with. So thank you again so much for listening to today's episode. My name is Jess Leonju, and this is the Make Your Mind podcast, brought to you by Archleys. Bye for now. Thank you.